Welcome to the third in the series covering the 1985 series of games. In this video, we'll be covering the third traditional domain of warfare, naval. Naval warfare in 1985 is so far only found in Deadly Northern Lights and in the upcoming Sacred Oil module. In Deadly Northern Lights in particular, it's absolutely vital for both sides to understand the nuances and peculiarities of naval warfare if their plans are to succeed. Compared to ground and air, naval war is the one domain in which NATO has a decisive advantage over the Warsaw Pact. NATO has the most powerful fleet, and it has the most modern ships, excepting the lone Kirov battlecruiser in the Norwegian Sea. Unlike land combat, naval combat is very different. It is incorporated into movement like land combat, but it's not a guarantee that you're going to find your opponent. You will know that your opponent is in a megahex, one of these big megahexes like the one surrounding Bonhoeffer, but you don't know his exact position, and there is a high degree of chance in finding him, depending on his detection level, which we'll cover later on. Ships in the naval warfare system move in the megahexes. Each ship has a base movement speed of 12, unless it's slow, which it has 9. Subs have a base movement speed of 9, and slow submarines, which is the vast majority of submarines, have a movement speed of 6. This movement allowance is used to do everything you might want to do with your ship. That'd be movement, attack, unloading or offloading supplies, task force formation, and so on. For the most part, actual placement doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where in the megahex you are, but when it comes to things like mines or moving into the Norwegian fjords and avoiding these coastal batteries here, it does become rather more important. Let's see if we can just find a mine marker somewhere. Naval mines, yeah. If we place a naval mine there, and this ship has to move from here to Copenhagen, it can either choose to go through the naval mine or move in range of the coastal battery here. Obviously, a NATO destroyer wouldn't get shot at by the Swedish coastal battery, but I think you get the point. There are, overall, roughly speaking, on the most macro level, there are two types of ships. There are single ships, and these have their type printed in black for NATO or white for the Warsaw Pact. And there are, see if I can just find it since I'm an idiot and forgot to put it out. There are also, there are also squadrons. These have their types printed in orange. The big difference here is that single ships can go into task forces, while squadrons and submarine squadrons cannot. Squadrons can also not be sunk in one attack. Even if you roll 2 step losses on an attack, it still only takes 1 step loss. Otherwise, they function identically, have the same rules covering combat, covering movement, and so on and so forth. Every ship, you'll notice, just remove these move markers. Every ship, you'll notice, has 2 rows. The top row and the bottom row. The top row, the first number in the top row is the ship's toughness, i.e. how hard it is to damage. This will give it a modifier in resisting damage that is not equal to the toughness number, but is roughly half that. The second number is the regular flak rating. This is flank against incoming bombing attacks. Not standoff missiles, but incoming bombing attacks. It functions identical to ground flak, otherwise, but it cannot, and I cannot stress this enough, it cannot contribute to air superiority combat. The third letter in the top row is the missile flak, i.e. how good it is at shooting down incoming missiles, whether it be from standoff missiles or from regular naval combat. The bottom row. The first number in the bottom row is gun combat. How good it is at shooting its guns at other ships or coastal batteries. Second number is missile combat. How many missiles it can lob at the opponent, or how much missile strength it can lob at the opponent, I should rather say. And the third number is ASW. how good it is at shooting down submarines. In 1985, ships, squadrons, and task forces can go on patrol. This costs 6 movement points and is done during their own turn. When they're on patrol, they can react in the opponent's turn. For example, you take this NATO task force. As it moves into this megahex, the Soviet destroyer can choose to intercept this NATO task force. If you're intercepting a megahex away, there is a negative modifier. You could also choose to wait until the task force is in its own hex. They're still pretty difficult to intercept, but there's no longer any negative modifier. Otherwise, this functions exactly as if he were attacking the task force in his own turn. If the Soviet player is pretty confident that the task force is headed to a coastal hex to offload supplies, he could wait until he's in that coastal hex and wait until he is offloading supplies, which makes it easier because the detection level would be higher. Otherwise, a ship that is on patrol can only try to intercept once per turn, but it doesn't lose its on-patrol marker if it either succeeds or fails at that. What is a task force? Well, a task force is the basic way that most of your single ships is going to be moving during your play of Deadly Northern Light. A task force is the way you protect your valuable transports, the way you bunch together ships so they can move and attack as one, and it's the way most single ships are going to operate. Out of the gate, it costs 2 movement points to join, /form, /reorganize a task force. They are built up, as you can see here, into 3 sectors. The outer sector, the inner sector, and the core sector. You have to populate the core sector with at least 1 ship before you can populate the inner, and you have to populate the inner before you can populate the outer. You sort of built your task force inside out, so to speak. Furthermore, only frigates and destroyers can populate the outer shell. A task force will allow ships to combine their missile and ASW values for combat, and to protect valuable targets from being struck by missiles, as the target selection for that particular combat is random. So there is a chance that the missiles, in this case, will strike the destroyer and the frigate before it strikes any of the FRY. For detection, there are 4 separate levels of detection, ranging from 0 to 3. Now, detection does not accrue as you might be led to believe otherwise, but it is a function of a unit's position, in this case this Canadian destroyer, what it's doing in that exact instance, whether it's unloading supplies in a coastal hex or engaging in combat and so on, and whether or not it's inside a surveillance zone. For instance, this naval surveillance zone right here. A standard ship or task force on the sea, not in enemy surveillance zones or air superiority zone, which also increases detection, has a detection level of 0. It is very, very difficult to spot a ship with a detection level of 0, and nigh on impossible, but not totally impossible, to spot and engage a submarine with a 0 detection level not in an ASW surveillance zone. Detection level goes up, for instance, if you are in a port, if you're actively disembarking or embarking stuff, and the higher detection level you have, the easier it is to find you. The most basic way of increasing an opponent's detection level is through a surveillance zone. One of these doodads right here. Each side will have a number of surveillance zones available to them depending on the scenario, ranging from 1 to 4. Usually they have the same number of naval and ASW surveillance zones. Naval surveillance zones increase the detection level of surface ships by 1, and the ASW surveillance zone does not increase the detection level of the submarine, but it makes it easier to find. This is important for combat, since combat is also modified by the detection level of the target. Detection level for task forces. Task forces, their detection level is established in much the same way as single ships. But since task force information is hidden, normally hidden, detection level determines how much information your opponent has available. Remember, he cannot see this naval display, since that is hidden information. So with a detection level of 0, this is essentially hidden to him. He doesn't know anything. He doesn't know how many ships, what kind of ships, where they are, and so on. He knows there is a task force in that megahex, but not what it comprises. If it just has detection level 1, such as if it's only in a naval surveillance zone, He knows how many ships there are in total, and he knows the types of ships there are. He knows, for instance, that this task force has 7 ships, and he knows that there are FFGs, DDGs, and FRYs. He doesn't know how many of each type there is, but he knows there are 7 ships in total. If the task force also happens to be in an air superiority zone, he would know that there are 2 FFGs, 2 DDGs, and 2 FRYs. He would also know that there is 1 ship in the outer sector, 1 ship in the inner sector, and 5 ships in the core sector. But again, he doesn't know exactly if it's a DDG in the inner sector, if there are FRYs in the inner sector, or where they are. He just knows the amount of ships in each sector. If he chooses to intercept the task force, or the task force is in a coastal hex, embarking on unloading supplies, the detection level would go up to 3 in this case. +1 for being intercepted, +1 for being in a naval surveillance area, and +1 for being in an air superiority zone. With a detection level of 3, he has every information possible available to him. He knows exactly where the ships are. He knows exactly how many of each type. He knows exactly what kind of ships they are. If it's a, let's say, shitty British destroyer compared to a mighty Danish frigate. And it is very easy to find a ship with a detection level of 3, or very easy to find a task force with a detection level of 3, because the higher detection level, the easier it is to find you. Detection level can also increase as a consequence of combat. For instance, the attacker, in this case the Soviet task force, can choose to use active emissions. This will increase his own chances of finding you by about 10%, but it'll also increase his detection level for the ensuing combat, if there is a combat. The intercepted side will automatically have its detection level increased by 1. So if this task force finds the NATO task force, the NATO task force detection level will, in this case, go from 2 to 3. In missile combat, if the Warsaw Pact player decides to chuck missiles at the NATO player, his own detection level will go up by 1. So in this case, he used active emissions which brings his detection level to 1, and he's firing missiles, which brings his detection level to 2. But why does that matter in this case? He's already found you, and you don't need to find him. Well, detection level also plays a very important part in determining how easy it is to shoot down ships with missiles. If you have a detection level of 0, it is very, very hard to actually shoot you down with missiles, since there is a massive negative modifier applied to you. The higher your detection level, the easier it is to shoot down with missiles, essentially. Missile combat is the deadliest part of naval combat in 1985. We're going to run through this like an overview of how missile combat works before we go into an actual example. Both sides may choose to execute a missile attack, and if the interceptor, i.e. the initiator of combat, decides to fire missiles, their detection level goes up by 1. If an attacking submarine launches a missile attack, combat is immediately over afterwards with no chance of retaliation whatsoever. Otherwise, it proceeds with one side tallying up the total amount of missile strength, that is the middle number of the bottom row, and distributing it amongst the target sectors as he sees fit. It is entirely possible that you may not know whether or not there are ships in a given sector, so if in doubt, the core sector is always a safe choice, as there must always be ships there. Now, you shoot missile flank. This is where it can get a bit unmanageable, so if you need, just lay down 3 dice in a row to remember the missile strength headed into each sector. Flank in the outer sector shoots first. That is the last letter in the top row. It has its own special table. It's not analogous to regular flank against airplanes. And for each successful hit, they choose a sector that gets hit by 1 fewer missile. Then the inner sector shoots, and for each successful hit, they can choose either their own inner sector or the core sector that get hit by 1 fewer missile. And then the core sector shoots, and they obviously can only reduce missile strength in the core sector. They cannot reduce missile strength in the outer or inner sector because missiles travel outwards and in. Once final missile strength has been determined, you roll to find how many ships are hit in each sector. Depending on the number of missile firing ships, this is also one of the reasons why you may not want all your missile ships to shoot. It can be between 1 and 3 targets. If it's just one ship, there is a 50% chance of either hitting 1 or 2 ships. Once you have found the number of targets, decide randomly in the sector which of the ships are hit. Damage must be divided as evenly as possible. If you have only 1 missile strength, you choose which of the randomly selected targets get hit. You rinse and repeat for each sector. Since missile combat is simultaneous, you only apply damage after both sides have fired. So, if you sink some ships, they still get to fire back with their full strength, so to speak. After missile combat, you have the option of gun combat. The side with the highest movement allowance, usually 12, in this case they both have the same amount, decides if they want to go in for guns blazing. If both sides have the same movement allowance, it's the attacker or the initiator of combat that decides. Gun combat is relatively simple. The first thing you need to do is roll. Each side needs to roll for screening. Because both sides are going to be interwoven amongst each other, there is a high likelihood that some ships are not going to be able to shoot and some ships are not going to be able to be shot at. This is a die roll that determines which sector, if any, are screened. If a sector is screened, ships in that sector cannot shoot and they cannot be shot at. If all the sectors are screened, this is also a possibility, gun combat is immediately over. Otherwise, you proceed with the highest gun value first and then go down the list. This doesn't mean the highest value of each side first. This means the highest gun value in total. In this case, it would be one of the 2 Danish frigates that shoot first, followed by the British destroyer, I should say, followed by one of the Soviet ships, followed by either the Soviet or the British ships. In case of a tie, it's the active player, i.e. the one whose turn it is essentially, that gets to go first. When you run through all the ships that will shoot, both players, if they agree, can decide to fight another round of gun combat. Can only fight a maximum of 3 rounds. But it needs both players to agree. So if one player doesn't want to do that, the gun combat and subsequent naval combat is over. ASW combat. ASW combat is only conducted against or with submarines. You cannot attack submarines in bases with ASW combat. Likewise, submarines cannot attack ships or task forces in bases with ASW combat. For ASW combat against a task force, say this NATO task force right here, the submarine will strike first against its target sector. It can select any sector it wants, and if it selected an empty sector, say if it doesn't have any information on the task force, it can select another sector freely. In this case, let's just say it attacks the core sector. First, it'll have to go through the inner sector. The destroyer in the inner sector will be able to shoot freely at the Foxtrot. After that, it'll go into the core sector, at which point it'll shoot first before receiving retaliatory fire from the combined ASW value of the ships. The submarine can freely pick its target, but it's not really clear in the rules how that's done, whether it's freely picked or whether it's based on the amount of information available to you. Against a single ship, the side that shoots first is the side with the lowest detection value. In this case, there is no naval surveillance zone, there is no air superiority zone, so both ships have a detection level of 0. Then it comes down to who is the initiator. If the submarine attacked the frigate, it'll go first. If the frigate attacked the submarine, that will go first. Okay, let's put it into practice. Let's say this Soviet Foxtrot submarine, #Justice for Foxtrots, has successfully intercepted this NATO task force. As there is a naval detection marker, and the submarine successfully intercepted, let's disregard this air superiority area right now. and the submarine is successfully intercepted, the NATO task force detection level is at 2. This allows her to know how many ships are in each sector and how many ships of each type is in each sector. So she will know that in the core sector there are 3 FRYs, 1 DDG, and 1 FFG. She decides to sort of go for broke and head towards the core sector, towards the juicy transport ships. First, the outer sector will get a chance to blow the submarine up. It does not, followed by, I'm not going to spend time rolling dice and so on because that could take ages, followed by the inner sector. I get a chance to strike at the submarine. And now the submarine arrives at the core sector, where she will strike first at any target of her choosing. Granted, it is written a bit ambiguous as to how this actually works, but I'm going off on the basis that she can select a target based on the amount of information she has available. She knows there are FRYs, she knows there are DDGs, and she knows there are FFGs. So I'm going to assume that she only knows there are some of those ships, and if she chooses FRYs, and there are multiple types of FRYs, it'll be random, or if some of the damage, it'll be random between those. But it's not actually specified. So first, the outer sector will shoot first. It totals its ASW value, which is 2, and rolls against the toughness and detection level modifier of the sub. Sub has a toughness of 3, which is -1, detection level of 0, which is -6. Means it's very unlikely that a NATO player would do anything to the glorious hero of the Soviet Union. In fact, in this case, it's only a roll of a 20 that something would happen, i.e. one of the steps of the submarines would get destroyed. Moves on to the inner sector, exactly the same scenario, only a 20. And in the core sector, we have a bit more ASW value. We have 2 for the Danish frigate, 3 for the British destroyer, for 5, and then 2 for each of the FRYs. But the submarine does get to fire first in this case. She decides to shoot at one of the FRYs. Her ASW value is 5. The target's toughness is 3 for -1. The detection level is 2 for an additional -2, for a total of -3. After the attack, NATO would then total up their remaining ASW value and strike back, including anything that might have been damaged, although they will use their damaged ASW value in this case. And because the submarine has already attacked in this combat, its detection level is now 1, making it easier for the Forces of Freedom to strike back. Let's run through a segment of missile and gun combat, just for demonstration purposes. The Warsaw Pact player decides that he wants to take the fight to NATO, with his task force here against the NATO task force there. And let's assume that the interception roll succeeds, otherwise we could be clicking the button all damn day. Now, the NATO player's detection level is now 2. 1 for being in a naval surveillance zone, and 1 for being successfully intercepted. The Warsaw Pact player still has a detection level of 0. The Warsaw Pact player decides that he wants to launch missiles. So does the NATO player. It means the Warsaw Pact player detection level now goes up by 1, making it easier for the NATO missiles to impact. Let's just tally up the relative, or the total missile strength of each side. The Warsaw Pact player has 11, 2 for each destroyer, and then 5 for a cruiser. The NATO player has 21. Let's just unflip that. 21. It has 7 for each frigate, 5 for a destroyer, and 2 for a destroyer. It doesn't matter who gets to shoot first in this case, since all combat is simultaneous. But let's just have the Warsaw Pact player unleash the socialist might upon the NATO imperialist bastards. It decides that since NATO detection level is at 2, it knows how many ships are in each sector. And the Warsaw Pact player is pretty confident that NATO wouldn't put FRYs in the outer sector to bait missiles. And even that, I mean, hey, you shoot down a transport ship. So it's gonna lob 6 of its missiles in the outer sector and 5 of the missiles in the inner sector. The Danish frigate shoots down a missile with its missile flag. It's in the outer sector, so it can shoot down a missile heading to either the outer sector or the inner sector. It decides to shoot down a missile headed towards itself. The HMS Glasgow also shoots down a missile. It cannot, however, choose to shoot down a missile that was going to the outer sector, as missiles travel outwards, and then it can only choose to take out a missile that was headed towards the inner sector, or if missiles had been flying to the core sector, shoot down a missile that was headed towards there. So now we have 5 missiles in the outer sector and 4 missiles in the inner sector. We would randomly roll to see how many targets get hit, and then decide randomly which ships get hit. But in this case, there's only 1 ship in each sector, so we don't need to bother with that. So the Alfred Fischer is going to receive 5 missiles to its exterior, while the HMS Glasgow is going to take on 4 missiles. You find the die roll modifier of the toughness. The die roll modifier of having a toughness of 6 is -2, and the detection level modifier is 0. Detection level is 2, means the missile modifier is 0, for a total of -2. 5 missiles rolling high enough is enough to take out one of the steps of the Alfred Fischer, which leaves it severely degraded. The inner sector does not get hit, or the HMS Glasgow does not take a step loss from the 4 missiles. The Warsaw player, we assume, just rolled low enough that that's not a problem. The NATO player now gets to shoot back, and remember, since damage is simultaneous, the Alfred Fischer counts as not being damaged. So we have 21 missiles. Let's just shoot 7 into each sector. The flak in the outer sector misses, the flak in the inner sector misses, and the flak in the core sector misses. So each sector will have 7 missiles headed towards it. Let's just say it sinks that one completely, delivers 2 step losses to the Kashin, send us to the graveyard. The inner sector takes a step loss, and the core sector is completely untouched. That is essentially combat, essentially missile combat. One thing to note, that in missile combat you have a chance to run low on ammo. If you roll between 1 and 10 in any of your attack rolls, meaning anything that goes to the outer sector, anything that goes to the inner sector, anything that goes to the core sector, one of the ships participating in that, randomly chosen, will get what's called an ammo or missile halved marker, which halves their missile value rounded down. So the 7 would go to a 3, essentially as if it had been damaged. If it receives another missile half marker, it will run out of ammo until it can return to a port and replenish its ammo. You might ask, well, isn't that a negative if I choose to shoot at 3 sectors? I have to roll 3 times instead of only 1 if I only shoot at 1 sector? And the answer is yes. It does take more missiles to hit a task force that's spread out. If you're focusing only on 1 sector, you can essentially saturate the close-in weapon systems of the ships, and it requires fewer missiles to hit a target. Rather than if you spread out, you're going to have to fire more missiles because you're going to have to deal with overlapping fields of close-in weapon system fire. That is the prime reason why you roll 3 times, why there is a higher chance of running out of ammo when targeting multiple sectors. And I think that basically covers missile combat. Let's just cap it off. You distribute your total missile strength freely amongst the sectors. You can choose not to target any sector, or you can choose to shoot everything you have into 1 sector. But remember, total attack value against the ship is 9. So if you have 30 missiles headed into 1 sector, you're probably going to waste some of that depending on how many ships you roll to hit. Then you modify your die by the toughness and the detection level modifier. And again, remember, toughness level is not a direct modifier. It has its own table. It's usually halved. It's usually halved to -1. So a toughness value of 6 would be a modifier of -2. Likewise, a toughness value of 8 would be a modifier of -3. And then you roll to see how much damage you do. And if you roll between a 1 to 10 on the die, one randomly chosen ship of all the ships firing missiles will halve their ammo, which halves their missile strength. Okay, now we rush in for gun combat. This is decided by the task force with the highest movement allowance. In this case, they both have the same movement allowance. So in this case, it would be the attacker, the initiator of combat, that decides if it wants to rush in. The Warsaw Pact player definitely wants to rush in. They have more ships to lose than the NATO player. Their ships are, on the whole, less valuable. The first thing we roll for screening. Each side will roll its own screen. I'm not gonna roll dice because this is just for demonstration purposes. The Warsaw Pact player finds that none of his sectors are screened, and the NATO player finds that his core sector is screened, which means that all these ships cannot shoot. Let's just delete them for now. NATO, having the highest gun value with the Alfred Fischer and the HMS Glasgow, will shoot first before any of the Soviet ships can shoot back. They decide to shoot the cruiser. The cruiser has a toughness value of 7 for, I think it's a -3 modifier, and unlike any other type of naval combat, there is no modifier for detection value here, since you can both pretty much see each other, and ECM doesn't work too well against a 10-kilogram slug heading straight towards you. That is pretty much gun combat. Gun combat is very simple. First, just go down the level of the gun value and then pick a target and then shoot. Damage here is not simultaneous. So the Alfred Fischer shoots at the Cresta. I don't know which specific Cresta this is. And damages it for flipping it over. Then the Glasgow will shoot the same, and then that will send it to the bottom. Now all of the Soviet ships will shoot back. They shoot back one at a time. So they can shoot at a target, damage it, and find out that they really want to send it to the bottom. And after that, after both sides have shot, if both players agree, there will be a second round of gun combat. They don't have to agree, but as long as they both agree, there will be a second round. Again, as I said before, maximum of 3 rounds. And if one player does not want to do another round of gun combat, I think in this case the Soviets definitely does not want to do gun combat again. Naval combat is over. Okay, nearly there. Transport ships. There are 4 values that essentially govern transport ships. Amphibious capability, the wavy blue line here. Supply capacity, the orange number. Troop capacity, the blue number. And whether or not the ship is slow. This is especially important when it comes to amphibious operations and ferrying supplies to and fro. Troop capacity, blue number, is obviously used for ferrying troops. Your combat units take a different amount of capacity depending on size, just like air transport. It's 9 for divisions, 3 for brigades, and 1 for battalions. You also use troop capacity for combat engineers, and you can choose to use either troop or supply capacity, or combine them, for E-War, ADA, division/brigade basis, or supply. Supply capacity is used, unsurprisingly, for supply. It's also used to transport HQs and artillery. It doesn't matter the size of the artillery unit, it's a fixed cost of 6. Transport helicopters take supply capacity, and combat helicopters, that is helicopters without a transport capacity, can use either. If you are in a task force, you can combine transport capacity. And only ships with the amphibious capacity, the blue wavy line, can offload troops in a non-port hex. And this is very important to keep in mind, otherwise you may find yourself doing something that you think you could do, but in fact you cannot. Depending on where you take on or offload supplies and troops, the movement point cost involved is different. It's cheapest to do so in a port or naval base, and the most expensive to do so in a coastal hex. If you need to reorganize the cargo or troops or your transport ships for whatever reason, there's also a movement point cost associated with that if you're in a task force. In 1985, there are also mine layers and mine sweepers. Mine layers and mine sweepers each combine their special ability into the movement point cost. It takes 6 movement points to deploy a mine. You do so by simply going into a mega hex, choosing a specific hex, and then spending 6 movement points on plumping down 1 level of mine. Mine level goes from 1 to 3. Likewise, minesweepers will go into a mega hex, go to the specific hex, and then spend 6 movement points on removing 1 level of mine. If a ship or a task force moves into a mined hex, and this is public knowledge where mines are, for some reason I disagree on that, the attack value of the mine is the mine level multiplied by 3, so it goes from 3 to 6 to 9. If a task force moves into the mine, the owner of the task force decides which ship sails into the mine first. Or which ship sails into the mine, essentially. Remember, mines are not removed once they've been triggered, so if you were sailing into dangerous water, you really want to bring a minesweeper. Mines can also be deployed by the air from planes with a strike value of 5. It works like a regular ground strike mission, except you increase the level of mines for each surviving step of planes with strike value of 5, up to a maximum of 3. Mines and coastal batteries can really hamper fleet movement. Coastal batteries, they have a hex range of 1. This, for example, this coastal battery in Malmö. They can shoot an unlimited amount of times in a turn. So if I move this mine layer first through the Swedish coastal battery, although I can't really shoot at NATO, but would be able to shoot at the mine layer, and then the minesweeper can shoot, and then the coastal battery again can shoot at the minesweeper. If it's a task force, it works like regular gun combat. Coastal battery has a gun combat value of 4 and a toughness of 8. Remember, all these ships moving through would also have been able to fire back. But against the task force, the coastal battery can only shoot once. The way to destroy them, in gun combat, they have 2 steps, but otherwise they can be destroyed like any other installation by bombing from the air, nuking, special forces, and so on. So the last thing that we're going to talk about in this video are convoys. Convoys are the way that you automate shuffling of supplies to and from ports. They function sort of like task forces, except that the marker stays physically in place, and you place convoy markers that are the same number as the convoy that you have along every point in the route. So let's say we want to create a convoy from Belchis to the port of Ama. We would create a convoy marker here, 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 and here. And that would be the convoy route. The convoy will take on as many supplies as the combined troop and supply capacity of transport ships, modified by the distance according to the convoy table, which is not public yet. Convoys can have ships added to them in either the starting or the arrival port, and they can be intercepted along any point in the route, either by ships that are on patrol if it is not your turn, or by ships that are actively intercepting the convoy in their own active turn. Otherwise, they function, combat with a convoy functions as a task force. So just remember to, for the Soviets, mostly Soviets are going to be doing convoys. They're going to have to assign some combat ships in order to protect their valuable transport ships. Otherwise, they're just going to get shot to bits. That's sort of the last part of this Naval War video. The next video is going to be on supply, and hopefully it'll be a bit shorter than this monster 40-minute long video. And the last video we're going to be doing is going to be a bit about different strategic choices and ways to, not say consider directly, but ways to handle multi-domain and multi-theater operations.